will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Yesterday,
Good afternoon, good morning, good day, everyone in the Power Hour Nation. Today is that day of infamy, the 77th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. And we have a special show. I want to have a very, very special show by calling in Robert Stinnett, a Power Hour veteran, unfortunately, and a veteran of World War II. But he passed away November the 6th. This year, and at 94 years old, so a terrible, terrible loss of a great academic naval officer who really, really put the story straight about what happened on that fateful day. So your guest host, George Freund from Canada, is going to have a guest from South Africa to turn this into a very, very international show. Dr. Peter Hammond, a scholar and Christian missionary with Frontline Fellowship in Africa, a man who's been under fire in very many dangerous places, setting up schools in countries that are probably places you would never want to go to. They've been bombed, strafed, shot at, stabbed, arrested, imprisoned for preaching the gospel and getting out the word of the Lord, the truth, to people, and we like to talk to him about that someday in more detail. But he did an excellent video presentation on Pearl Harbor, and that's why I asked him to come aboard to the USS Power Hour so that we can fill you in on some of the details. And this is a very, very important story, even though you think it's 77 years ago and these people are long gone and it doesn't apply to you anymore. This is the trick of war and how you're manipulated into war. There's an old philosophical saying that goes, only the dead have seen the end of war. And that's always been true because generally the young refuse to learn how these tricks are played. And when you read Robert Stinnett's book and you see all the machinations that went on behind the scenes, all the declassified documents that he has put in this book, all the first-hand accounts, that he went and interviewed so many people in the intelligence services and the military services to find out what truly happened, that, he, in my opinion, is one of the greatest Americans that, basically ever lived for doing this. And I found it very timely that I read his book prior to 9/11 so that I was fully informed on how these tricks work, how the new Pearl Harbor was played out so that I could be a better spokesperson on that. And, Robert did survive the war, and he came back and he was a reporter. And, he took one of the greatest sports shots in history for one of the greatest plays in football history. It was a college game, Stanford Cardinal and the California Golden Bears, November the 10th, 1982. And you can find this on YouTube to watch this game. It was all a series of lateral passes that got a touchdown. And it is just an amazing play. And as the player was coming across the goal line with the ball, he snapped a great sports picture of him colliding into a musician with the team. And, the rest is history. But when he retired from his reporter job at sportscasting, he was very, very keen on finding out the truth. He read At Dawn We Slept, The Untold Story of Pearl Harbor, and that motivated him to find out what really happened. And I was blessed to talk to him on the Power Hour many, many long years ago in A Miracle of Miracles. I got in at the very end as a caller, and I was able to ask him a question with only about 5 minutes remaining in the show, and I was glad that we had the chance because he told me something I didn't know, and I was able to tell him something he didn't know, and it was just good energy to put that out. And the big piece was, these attacks were printed in the newspapers. The Hilo Tribune Herald, the Honolulu Advertiser, printed the story, the Japanese may attack over the weekend. So there is no surprise. And they gave these papers to the wounded, and then the wounded maybe they didn't read the papers normally, and they were just dumbfounded that how could this be in the papers, and how could we be taken and hurt like this in such a devastating battle? Well, immediately, federal authorities, and I believe he said it was the FBI, came in and confiscated all these newspapers, and a few enterprising wounded stuffed them in places that you couldn't find them too easy, under bandage dressings or in a cast, so that they could smuggle them out of the hospital eventually. So no one would know that they had these copies to give to the world, and there was a picture of one of these papers, one of the original ones, on his website that I saved and just look at for a reminder to tell me how the world really works. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes across as, like some type of intellectual victim of treachery from Japan. And when you look into his history about where he went, what he did, what he said in his earlier years, there is absolutely no way he couldn't be prepared for this. Going back to his university education in 1902, while he was studying at Harvard, a Japanese student there advised him of the 12-step, 100-year plan the Japanese devised in 1889 to dominate the world, taking over the Pacific region, including Hawaii, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So right from the very beginning, in his student years, he's aware of this. And he was a very big naval man. He was very, very keen on ships. And one of his first major government postings was to be Undersecretary of the Navy. And he was very well read, very well spoken on these affairs. And the biggest affair going on, because we're in the days before television, before the Internet, the book was king. And there was a series of books written by a British World War I intelligence officer, and you'll find a very well codified explanation of this in another book called Visions of Infamy by William H. Honan, and he was a New York Times reporter who passed away in 2014. And I almost fell over when I started to read this book about these other books. They said they were the most popular books in the English-speaking world. So one of them was called Sea Power, and it was all about the development of sea power in the Pacific. And the other one was called The Great Pacific War, written in 1921 and 1925. They were the talk of the planet Earth. Far better than our, probably modern fiction stories. But these books explained how the Japanese were going to attack. And the Japanese used these books as training material at the Japanese Imperial War College, because a famous Japanese admiral, Isoroku Yamamoto, was the Washington, D.C. naval attaché, thoroughly fluent in English, well known to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He bought the books. He took them back to Japan, had them translated, and they were used overwhelmingly to teach all Japanese naval officers strategy. And where Hector C. Bywater, the unmatched authority in naval affairs, post-World War I up to World War II when he died, everybody listened to him on the planet Earth that had anything to do with anything in the Navy. Hitler even quoted some of his lines from his books in Mein Kampf. Mussolini invited him to review his Navy. The French did the same. So did the Japanese. He was the tour de force in naval strategy, specifically with the Pacific Ocean. And everybody was talking about, when this happens, Japan's going to take Hawaii. So you would have to be dumber than a bag of nails to not understand that this is the foremost thing that's going to happen. And it's just beyond belief that the Undersecretary of the Navy, who becomes the President of the United States, and who had these books in his library in 1936, because they're dated and stamped and they're in the FDR library, most likely today, unless someone's sneaking them out the back door as we speak, that he was aware, he read them, he understood all the strategies. Bywater even came up with the island-hopping campaigns the United States would use to get the territories back. And when these books were written, Pearl Harbor wasn't even Pearl Harbor. The contracts were just being given out to build a harbor. And the Japanese were already sizing this up to take it. And this is part of the grand strategy that goes on in wars, that they happen many, many long years before they occur. And all the warning signs are there. You can't miss them unless you close your eyes and go to sleep. And when the book written at dawn we slept, it was almost like for many people, it wasn't they were sleeping, because you can be woken up when you're sleeping. It was they were anesthetized. And this is a sad thing, especially for people who are in the military. You have to be alert. You have to be prepared. You have to be on your guard because you're defending your country. And when you start to see things going south or things starting to come apart, you have to be prepared to take action. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, one of the other major factors that we have to deal with in these issues is treacherous people on the inside. And one of the biggest shocks I ever got in this Pearl Harbor study, that is one of my favorite passions, is in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur was stationed, and he was paid off by President Quezon of the Philippines. He got $500,000 from the Philippine Treasury. And what do you think that was for? To stand down. Because not only did we have a surprise attack, 9 hours later we had another surprise attack. So how many surprise attacks are we supposed to get before somebody comes on and points a finger and says, there must be complicity here? Somebody knew, and they let it happen. They let it happen on purpose because they could garner a political support to get a war going. So if I just come to you and say, well, let's go attack some nation, you'll laugh at me and go do what you normally do somewhere. But if I make it look like we've been vilified by an enemy, and I form a great case in the propaganda media, you'll willingly go. You'll willingly sacrifice your children in some war that really is about order. Because the big thing we fought about then, and we're still fighting about now, is who's going to be the new world order. Not about various sundry things like freedom. That's seldom ever the cause. One of the things I've learned from a great book I read by Winston Churchill was Japan and Germany were resisting the new order that was coming to Europe. And I'd always thought that the Axis powers were the new order, but they weren't. It was us. The Axis powers were called the New Christian Order, working in league with the Vatican. And we'll catch you on the other side of the break and get into a little bit of the action in the Philippines. Welcome back to Power Hour Nation. I'm your guest host, George Freund. This is The Nation, the radio station that will divine the truth. And that's something we said in a previous show we did when we went to Dallas for the JFK assassination. There are certain fundamental truths that will set us free. Pearl Harbor is one of them, of course, but for the generation that's before me, and maybe even a bit of the generation before them, because they were too young at the time. And we have to learn these truths and disseminate them. Isoroku Yamamoto went through 40 newspapers every day while he was in Washington as a naval attaché to pick up any little hint of intelligence that he could get to pass on to the Japanese to show our weakness and to build their strength. And this is fundamental. Reading is such a powerful tool to have at your disposal. In 1940, the Japanese wrote a book, The Three-Power Alliance and a U.S.-Japanese War, naval intelligence book done by the Black Dragon Society, outlining what they were going to do to us. So they didn't sleep. They were proposing it to everyone. And it's just inconceivable that naval attachés and diplomats in Japan weren't doing the same thing that Yamamoto was doing in Washington, scouring everything. And that's their job. That's, primarily what the fundamental job of the CIA is supposed to be doing today, is to be scouring all these documents and papers and getting into these things so that you can know firsthand what's going on. It's just absolutely imperative. I just, boggle at the mind that how can people get these jobs and not be the slightest bit aware of what their primary duties and functions are, and that how can we ever be surprised? This is the thing. And, we try our best, but were swimming upstream, to say the least. A great movie that was out a long time ago to illustrate this was 3 Days of the Condor. If you've never seen that, with Robert Redford, that's a CIA analysis station that's attacked and all the operatives are put to death, and Robert Redford survives because they read the books. They know something that's going to happen, and they're just taken out of business. And that's what happened too. Hector Bywater's associate was another journalist by the name of Cox in Tokyo. Before Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1940, he was arrested by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military secret police, taken to their police headquarters, tortured, and thrown out a third-floor window of police headquarters and killed because he was a source for information going to the United States and Britain to get the message out that this is coming. It's coming like a freight train. And General MacArthur was awoken at 3:40 a.m., Pearl Harbor happened. It was still under attack. There was a war plan. He was supposed to implement this war plan. It was called Rainbow 5. And part of that was to launch an aerial attack against Formosa. He had 34, I believe, B-17s, which were the most powerful military aircraft in the world at the time. And he was supposed to bomb the Japanese before they could really get started. And that air raid would have probably prevented the invasion of the Philippines because the Japanese were fogged in, and they had all their toys on the field, and they probably would have been wiped out. Maybe he would have been lucky enough to get some of the troop ships, and that would have pretty much stopped the war in its tracks from making it as bad as it was. But he didn't do it. He was begged by one of the air chiefs, Brereton, and he went after him, let me go, this is the plan, I have to attack. And MacArthur just kept turning him down. And then finally, when he gave permission to do it, it was about, between 11 and 12. They started loading the planes. They're on the runways. They're being fueled up. There's bombs everywhere. Guess who comes when all your toys are on the deck? The Japanese. And the fire and flames were beyond belief because you got tanker loads of fuel going up with the explosives. Everyone was barbecued alive practically. It was a horrible, horrible thing. And then what happened after that? The Battle of Corregidor, the Bataan Death March, and the terrible incarceration of all these men that were left in a far-off field where they could never be supported, reinforced, or evacuated. They were just left there like that. And that never should have happened. That's one thing I give the British SAS compliments for. Who dares, wins. And when you're in a fight like that, you better dare, because if you don't dare, then you're going to lose, and that's the worst thing that can happen to you. And this was whitewashed over because the war news took over everything. We really didn't find out too much about what happened in the Philippines until everything was over, and then we started to find out from Japanese prisoners of war what really happened there. And MacArthur covered it up. And conveniently, for a period of days, the most crucial days, December the 8th to December the 16th, all the records were destroyed. And we see this all the time, is that either the records are unavailable or they're destroyed. And we can never find out the truth about what really happened anywhere. But in union law, they call something a past practice, that because it's happened before, it can happen again. And this is something we have to understand and hold these people to the fire to say that it happens again and again and again. So on the other side of the commercial, we're going to bring in our guest, Dr. Peter Hammond from South Africa, who's a very well-spoken and knowledgeable man. Welcome back to Power Hour Nation. I'm your guest host, George Fine from Canada, and we have a very special guest because we're going to the other side of the world, to South Africa, to interview Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder and director of Frontline Fellowship, a man who's been on the front line of missionary work in many, many dangerous countries and preaching the gospel and carrying education to people who would be deprived of it, and a man who's very, very good at analyzing what is deep and dark in the hearts of some people to subvert our world, our Eden, take it and control it away from us. Pearl Harbor is one of the object lessons in this, and I was very fascinated at his YouTube that I stumbled upon, and the good Lord said, talk to that man and get him on the air so we can, advertise to the world about his mission, but also to teach Americans, especially the younger generation, about what these traps are so we never fall in another one as they're coming about. Welcome aboard, Peter. It's good to hear your voice. I love it.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm all the way from Cape Town, so I'm about as far away as you can be from you, the uttermost parts of the earth.
Oh, indeed. Well, Africa is, to me, I always love watching documentaries on Africa. I love the terrain, the beauty, the history. It is just such a fascinating place to be. And, but we'll relish that at another time and get into some of the meat and potatoes while we have time. I was very fascinated by your lecture on naval strategies, and one of the ones that I like to bring up first is you started to talk about the Copenhagen of the fleet, where a fleet is kept in like an entrapment and is just all shot up by a potential enemy. And I think that's very important for naval strategists today, because a good part of the American fleet is under repair, especially many of the aircraft carriers, and they're in a vulnerable position, and the enemies today have far more advanced torpedoes that are even nuclear tipped and can just devastate a fleet that is entrapped, and we can never get falling for that trick again. So could you explain to us a little bit about what Copenhagen of the fleet means?
Yes, certainly. The Copenhagening of the fleet comes from the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen. Well, back on the 2nd of April, 1801, Admiral Horatio Nelson did the classic Copenhagening of the fleet, which was a clear inspiration for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, because although Denmark was officially neutral during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain feared that Copenhagen's or Denmark's navy may be seized by the French if Denmark fell to the French. Now, it didn't fall to the French, and they weren't seized by the French, but it might be. And so the Royal Navy always had a policy that the Royal Navy must remain stronger than the next two navies combined. And so looking at the French fleet and looking at the Danish fleet, they said, well, let's get rid of the Danish fleet, remove them from the equation, even though they were neutral. So the Battle of Copenhagen was when Sir Admiral Hyde Parker and Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson led the attack on the Danish capital, Copenhagen. There was no declaration of war. The British attacked. In fact, this is where Admiral Nelson famously placed his telescope to his blind eye over his patch, ignoring the command to withdraw. And he, from the British perspective, the attack on the unsuspecting Danish navy in Copenhagen was spectacularly successful. They sunk just about the entire Danish navy, killing 1,600 Danish soldiers and sailors, and severely damaging or destroying or capturing the rest of the fleet. So this was done once. Well, later in August to September 1807, the Royal Navy decided to Copenhagen the fleet again. If they felt that the Navy in Denmark in the previous 6 years had been able to rebuild somewhat. So they came and they bombarded the capital, Copenhagen, from the sea. Denmark chose to join the French. They did. In this attack, they killed 3,000 soldiers and civilians, including about 195 children, as a result of the bombardment. Now, as the majority of the Danish Navy was at the southern border to prevent a possible attack from the French, the Imperial Japanese Navy was modeled on the British Royal Navy. And so these famous battles and strategies and tactics of Copenhagen, the fleet of even neutral countries where potential threat was perceived, including even more recently against Britain's French allies in the Second World War. So when people were saying, well, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was unprecedented, nobody could have perceived it, well, that's absolute nonsense, because any naval person, anyone who knew naval history at that stage, which the Japanese certainly did, would have known of these precedents. And bear in mind, they were trained by the British and were modeled on the Royal Navy, so you could expect them to carry out the Royal Navy type of naval doctrine of Copenhagening the fleet.
Well, yes, indeed. In 1904, they did it very clearly when they attacked Port Arthur. They caught the forces there in a similar situation and destroyed them. The Japanese Navy was very, very successful in fighting Russia, and in those days, and it was just an absolute rout to take on a very powerful industrialized country and knock them asunder just by having the ability to dare it. And then, of course, in World War II, you mentioned the attack on Toronto, the 11 November 1940 attack where the British attacked with swordfish fighters the Italian fleet. And what happened there?
Well, yes, and that's an excellent example because that happened just a year before. And so the night of the 11th to the 12th of November 1940, so a full year, and in fact just about 13 months before Pearl Harbor, you had an air attack on a navy, another Copenhagen the fleet, and in this case it was the British Royal Navy under Admiral Andrew Cunningham, using the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, launched swordfish biplane torpedo bombers in the Mediterranean Sea to attack the Regina Marina, that's the Italian fleet, the battle fleet at anchor in the harbor of Taranto. And despite the shallow depth of the water, the aerial torpedoes proved devastatingly effective, crippled the attack, lost half of its capital ships in one night. And this attack was so significant because the Taranto Bay attack by the Royal Navy, their air power actually specifically, marked the ascendancy of air power over sea power. So the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm had now proven that aircraft with torpedoes can be more powerful and more effective than battleships. And the Royal Navy had shown the way, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had followed the Copenhagen fleet, as you pointed out, in 1904 and 1905, taking on the Russian Navy at Port Arthur. So plainly, the Japanese Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, had learned their lesson. They had 10 fleet carriers, 10 aircraft carriers, and they were practicing with torpedo bombers. And to say that there's no way that America could foresee a torpedo attack on the ships in Pearl Harbor is ridiculous, because, in fact, the American Navy had months before, considering Taranto, they had actually discussed this new threat in a June 1941 memorandum. So this is 6 months before Pearl Harbor. They had discussed installing torpedo nets in Pearl Harbor as a precautionary measure against torpedo aerial attacks planes launched from aircraft carriers. And Admiral Kimmel and his staff testified that the decision not to install torpedo nets and booms had been made by the Navy Department in Washington, D.C., not in Hawaii. In Hawaii, the naval officials wanted torpedo nets. They were vetoed on that on Washington. So it's absolutely outrageous that people can still be putting forward the fiction that the attack on Pearl Harbor was unprecedented and a surprise, and that nobody could have foreseen it, because it was definitely precedented, and it definitely could be foreseen. And in fact, Admiral Kimmel testified later that they felt that they were being put in a place of danger, because you know that the American Pacific Fleet's headquarters was actually in San Diego in California, and they had been moved on the express order of the American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to put the entire battle fleet in Pearl Harbor, which the Navy complained. Admiral Kimmel said just one ship sunk in the harbor mouth and the entire battle fleet is holed up and it's like a turkey shoot. It's a very vulnerable place to put your entire battle fleet. And the decision to place the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor was a political one. It wasn't a naval one. And the Navy actually complained and said, this isn't necessary and this isn't wise. And this is, in fact, it's not just a provocation to Japan, but it's like a temptation for them to take out the Navy, which is being put there as a threat to them.
Yeah, so the whole positioning of the fleet in Pearl Harbor was, a pie in the face to the Japanese to, instigate them or push them, and especially with their Bushido code of being militaristic, that you would offend them and they would attack you. So we'll get into that on the other side of the break. I hear the music coming on, and we'll probably get into McCollum's memo about how we get war. Welcome back to the Power Hour. I'm your guest host, George Freund. joined, and we have Dr. Peter Hammond from South Africa giving us some great historical perspective on the Pearl Harbor attack. And we're going to continue with a very special naval officer that worked very, very closely with President Roosevelt. And his name was Commander McCollum, and he was born in Japan, raised in Japan, and joined the Navy later, and being a specialist was sent back to Japan to work in the diplomatic corps. And he was asked, what can we do to stimulate a war with Japan? And he wrote an 8-point memo to the president, and it is very, very revealing to know that this memo existed, and this was this type of chicanery that was going on in the White House, and with the globalist elites that perpetrate wars and make us to suffer, pretending we're fighting under the guise of freedom. Could you advise us on what happened with this memo and what was in it?
Well, yes, indeed. And in fact, it's worth noting that the Commander McCullen memo of 7 October 1940 remained classified until 1994. So when governments seal something up for 54 years, you've got to know they're hiding something really serious. So in Day of Deceit by Robert Stinnett, this memorandum prepared by Commander McCullen gets some coverage. And it's a pre-war memorandum dated 7 October 1940 in response to the request from the administration, how can we provoke war from Japan, because they want Japan to initiate the war. And so he, along with Secretary Knox of the Navy, offered 8 specific plans to aggrieve the Japanese empire, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, is the way it read. Now, amongst it included economic sanctions, convincing the British to open up Singapore for the American Navy to be there too, so that would be, again, another provocation, to get the Dutch government to refuse to sell oil or rubber to the Japanese, which was absolutely essential to their war effort. I mean, Japan didn't really have enough of its own raw materials to survive, and they were engaged in a very serious fight in Manchuria and China at that moment, amongst others with the communists, of course, the communists who ultimately took over China. In one sense, you could see Japan as probably the single greatest force preventing communism taking over East Asia, particularly China. And, of course, the end result of the war against Japan was ultimately to hand over North Korea and the whole of China to communism, and with disastrous consequences leading all the way through, not just to the Korean War, but to the Vietnam War, Laos, Cambodia, and a whole lot more. But I'm running ahead of myself. So in this McCullen memorandum were 8 points, which basically was total economic warfare on Japan. And there's interesting responses to it because, for example, you've got General MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, who said that this, and this is quoted in President Herbert Hoover's book, Freedom Betrayed, General Douglas MacArthur said, the whole war with Japan was a madman's desire to get us into war. He said financial sanctions as part of the Commander McCullen memorandum were not only provocative, but it was bound to force Japan to fight, even if it was suicidal. Because unless these economic sanctions could be removed, the sanctions carried every penalty of war, except killing and destruction. No nation of dignity would tolerate it for long. And then General MacArthur said, President Roosevelt could have made peace with Konyai, the Prime Minister of Japan, in September 1941. He could have obtained all the American objectives in the Pacific and the freedom of China, probably even Manchuria itself. Konyai was authorized by the Emperor to agree to a complete withdrawal from China. So General MacArthur expressed to President Herbert Hoover his bitterness about Roosevelt's starvation of supplies to him and his men on the Philippines at a time when the whole fate of the South Pacific and the allies in Asia was at stake, and that President Roosevelt showed his vindictiveness in many ways. And he said that again, General MacArthur speaking after the war, peace could have been made with the Japanese any time after the Philippines was taken. With their supporting legs cut off, starved of rubber, starved of oil, starved of all the petroleum products, they were beaten, economically beaten. He said Roosevelt, however, was determined that the war continue. It could have ended right at the beginning, January already 1945 with Japan, but they didn't want that. General MacArthur went further and said, we didn't need to fight a war against Japan in the first place. We didn't need it to last so long. We certainly didn't need to drop the atomic bomb. And we certainly didn't need to bring Russia in and give them the whole of Sakhalin Island, North Korea, Manchuria, and China effectively. And so General MacArthur and President Herbert Hoover write scathingly about both Franklin Delano Roosevelt's policies and Truman's policies, which basically made a puppet state out of Manchuria for the Soviet Union, betrayed all of China and Mongolia to communism, and gave North Korea to the communists twice over. Even after he had liberated it in 1950, they still had to hand it back to the communists. So it's very interesting to see how generals like General MacArthur were scathing about FDR's policies and Truman's policies in the Pacific.
Well, one thing I came across in my research was a book called Operation Snow, and it was all about how there was a Soviet mole in FDR's White House, and he was working for Henry Dexter White, I believe his name is, yes. And he was with the Treasury Department, and he was the one just kind of like greasing the wheels that everything that would happen would work to the benefit of the Soviet Union and Stalin. And, of course, the most important thing for him is the fact that you have to get Japan off his back so that he isn't going to fight a two-front war while he's fighting Germany on the other side. And it would be the strategic, necessity to instigate something between the United States and Japan so that he would be free not just fight the two-front war, but be able to take all his troops that are on that side of the Soviet Union. Primarily, a lot of them were the Siberian, snow regiments and fighters that were just crucial in fighting in northern Russia on the other side of the front against the Germans when it got to that point in time. And these are not just little factoids or whatever, but they just show you that we have an administration that was just totally under control of a foreign power, pretending to be loyal to America and leading its sons and daughters into a terrible calamity, not for their benefit in any way, shape, or form, but to benefit a foreign power so that they can have dominion over great swaths of the planet Earth, if not eventually even controlling the United States and the other allied countries as well. This communist threat back then, and it's probably still today, is one of the greatest threats to any type of normal, decent existence in the human family. And it's something we have to be on guard for. And to the younger generation, I say, you've just talked a lot about sanctions and what they're really for. That's all that's in the news lately with, issues with Russia and the United States about sanctions against Iran. I start to look at some of these sanctions in the same light, that it's like you're trying to provoke a fight as opposed to stop one. And we'll be back on the other side of the break and continue with our geopolitical strategies of past and present. Thank you very much.